Hey, beautiful souls. Before we dive into Dorothy's incredible journey, I want you to know that this story might hit close to home for many of you. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, or questioned your worth after years of giving, this one's for you. Dorothy's transformation will remind you that it is never too late to reclaim your power and write your own ending. Let me know in the comments if you have experienced something similar. Your stories matter and inspire others in our Her Light community. Now, let's step into Dorothy's world. At the breakfast table in Murphy's Diner, my daughter-in-law Nicole looked me directly in the eyes and said, "We have made a decision about the holidays. You will not be joining us this Christmas." I simply nodded, as though she would mention the weather forecast. My name is Dorothy Richardson, and I am 68 years old. I call this quiet corner of Millfield Springs, Vermont home, where the maple trees turn brilliant red each fall, and the winters stretch longer than a person might expect. If you are listening to this while sitting in your own empty kitchen, watching snow gather on the windowsill with only the refrigerator's hum for company, then perhaps you will understand what I am about to share. For decades, I answered to Mom, Grandma, the woman who never missed a birthday celebration or failed to appear when someone needed help. This year marks the first time no invitation arrived for the family gathering. Not because I committed some terrible offense, but simply because I would become invisible, present for so long that I blended into the scenery like old wallpaper. I am not sharing this story to seek sympathy or point fingers. I am telling it because somewhere out there, another person sits waiting for a phone call that will not come, staring at an empty chair that used to be theirs, holding gifts that will never be opened. If that describes you, please stay with me through this tale. I will share how I survived the coldest winter of my life and discovered the most important lesson of all: how to save space for yourself at your own table. The entire ordeal began on that bitter December morning at Murphy's Diner, the same establishment I would visited every Sunday for the past 8 years. "We have discussed it thoroughly," Nicole announced without any preamble. "This year will be just immediate family for Christmas dinner." I nodded again, not even bothering to set down my coffee mug. Murphy's Diner hadn't changed since the day it opened. Red vinyl booths with tiny tiers patched with electrical tape, checkered floors that showed every footprint, and walls covered in faded photographs of local high school football teams from the 1980s. The air always smelled like bacon grease and industrial coffee, not unpleasant, just tired. I always chose the booth near the front window, where I could watch the town's modest Christmas decorations, a single wreath on the post office door, and string lights that flickered more than they glowed. I ordered the same thing each week: black coffee and a blueberry muffin, toasted dark. Jenny, the waitress, with streaks of premature gray in her brown hair, knew my order by heart. "The usual, Mrs. Richardson?" she asked with genuine warmth, the only brightness in these increasingly formal family meetings. "Please, dear," I replied, managing a smile for her benefit. Nicole arrived precisely at 9 of the clock, punctual as always, carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions for others. Michael followed several minutes later, moving slowly like a man who would rather be anywhere else. He slumped into the booth without removing his winter jacket. Nicole straightened her spine against the vinyl seat, hands folded over the menu she never actually read. These Sunday meetings had evolved into announcements disguised as conversations, quick, efficient, conclusive. She didn't wait for our drinks to arrive before delivering her verdict. "We have discussed it thoroughly. This year will be just immediate family for Christmas dinner." I nodded once more, as if I would already accepted this outcome before she spoke. Michael glanced in my direction briefly, then studied the sugar packets arranged in their small metal container. Nicole continued speaking as though reading from prepared notes. "Emma's becoming more independent at 16, and we thought she might appreciate a quieter celebration. Lucas is only 8, so he will not really notice the difference. We are planning something more intimate this year." I nodded a third time, not in agreement, but to signal the end of this particular conversation. No one touched the muffin that arrived, warm beside my cooling coffee. I stood up slowly, reaching for my purse. I assume I am handling my own check today. I placed exact change on the table, counting each bill carefully to avoid leaving either too much or too little. Jenny approached with a small bag of homemade cookies tied with a red ribbon. These are fresh from this morning. Mrs. Richardson, my grandmother's recipe, she offered kindly. I looked at her earnest face, then shook my head gently. Thank you, but I will not need them today. No one called after me as I walked toward the door. No awkward explanations or half-hearted protests. I left Murphy's diner like an actor exiting a play where all her lines had been cut. The morning air bit sharply against my cheeks as I stepped outside. The sidewalk had been cleared of snow, but patches of black ice lurked in the shadows between buildings, treacherous and nearly invisible. I walked carefully toward my car, not because my legs couldn't handle the distance, but because nothing waited for me at home that required urgency. People hurried past with obvious destinations: the hardware store, the pharmacy, their warm houses. I used to walk this same route 12 years ago when I picked up Emma twice a week from elementary school. Nicole had seemed grateful then, always thanking me for the extra help and calling me a lifesaver. I remember one particularly snowy afternoon when she handed me a thermos of hot chocolate and said, "I don't know what we would do without you, Mom Richardson." Today, she knew exactly what they would do without me. They would plan it carefully. At the corner stood Henderson's used books, where I used to take Michael during his middle school years. He would spend entire afternoons staring at the astronomy section, dreaming of becoming a scientist. I eventually bought him a telescope that he used exactly 3 times. Now a handwritten sign in the window read, "Everything must go. Closing the 15th of January. Even the places that held my memories were disappearing, leaving behind empty storefronts like missing teeth in the town's smile. I paused outside the shop, not because I needed anything inside, but because I needed a moment to process what had just happened. Something fundamental had shifted during that brief conversation at Murphy's. The invisible thread connecting me to the word family had snapped, and no one had even noticed the sound. There is something uniquely devastating about realizing your presence no longer factors into anyone's plans. It doesn't create sharp pain. Instead, it hollows you out, like stepping into a familiar room where all the furniture has been rearranged around your absence. I fumbled for my car keys, hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from my body trying to recalibrate after Nicole's casual dismissal. She hadn't raised her voice or spoken cruelly. She would simply removed me from Christmas like crossing an item off a grocery list. Michael hadn't defended me. He would sat there silent as furniture, perhaps believing his silence maintained peace, or maybe assuming I was too resilient to be wounded. Neither of them had paused to consider whether I might have feelings about this decision. For years, I would been the one who gave up the comfortable chair, who served everyone else first, who prepared the holiday turkey without stuffing, because Nicole was allergic to celery. I would always been accommodating, agreeable, easy to overlook, until they decided I didn't need to be considered at all. Behind me, I heard Murphy's door chime as someone else entered the diner. The aroma of cinnamon rolls drifted out momentarily before the door swung shut again. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back through the window. Standing beside my car, in the crystalline morning air, one thought formed in my mind with perfect clarity. None of them remember that I was the one who helped them buy their first house. I drove home slowly through streets lined with houses, where families were probably planning their holiday celebrations, discussing who would bring what dish, and whether there would be enough seating for everyone. My small apartment waited for me with its familiar creaking floorboards and the gift box I would stored in the bedroom closet, packed and ready, as though this Christmas would unfold exactly like all the others. That cardboard box had become an annual ritual I would never questioned. Nobody ever formally invited me to Christmas dinner, not once in all these years. No one ever said, "Mom Richardson, we would love to have you join us." No one asked what dish I would like to contribute to the holiday meal. Yet every December, I prepared gifts weeks in advance. Each present was carefully selected and wrapped in festive paper with coordinating ribbons. I chose soft scarves for Emma, building sets for Lucas, kitchen gadgets for Nicole, and practical items for Michael. Usually a warm sweater paired with a gift card to his favorite electronics store. No one ever thanked me explicitly, but I hadn't expected gratitude. Back then, I believed that remembering someone was its own reward. I never questioned whether I belonged at these gatherings. I simply assumed my presence was understood, like electricity or running water, essential but invisible until it stopped working. Every early December, I would climb the stepladder to retrieve the Christmas storage box from the high shelf in my bedroom closet, even knowing I might not use half the items inside. Perhaps I would grown accustomed to preparation as insurance against being forgotten entirely. If I stopped participating in the rituals, it might become even easier for them to pretend I didn't exist. I opened the storage box carefully. Each ornament was wrapped in tissue paper, some faded from years of handling. A few showed hairline cracks where time had touched them gently but persistently. I cleaned each piece with a soft cloth, releasing the scent of dried pine from sprigs I would saved from previous year's wreaths. That fragrance transported me to earlier winters, when Michael's father was still alive, and we would buy a fresh tree tall enough to touch our living room ceiling. Every morning, I would find small puddles of sap that had dripped onto the hardwood floor overnight. Nicole used to call me the keeper of traditions during those years, the winter Michael lost his construction job. I didn't ask questions or offer advice. I simply transferred $5,000 into their bank account electronically, with no note or explanation attached. The money was never mentioned again, but I noticed Emma got new winter boots that month, and Michael stopped working evening shifts at the delivery service. When Nicole brought Lucas home from the hospital, she waited 3 days before calling me. "Could you possibly cook some meals for us? We are so exhausted," she would ask. I prepared soft foods and simple dinners every evening for 2 weeks, leaving covered dishes in their refrigerator. I never went inside during those visits, respecting their request for space to adjust as a family. I would lived with those small exclusions for so long that I couldn't remember the last time someone asked what I wanted or needed. I seemed programmed to hover at the edges of their lives, useful as long as I didn't require too much attention or occupy too much space. That afternoon, I walked to Stone & Stories bookstore, hoping to find something special for Emma. She would written me a note when she was 7. "Grandma. Don't forget candy canes for Christmas. I love the peppermint ones." I would kept that handwritten card in my wallet for years, until it became too worn to read clearly. The shop felt peaceful in the way that only bookstores can. All that accumulated wisdom creating a gentle hush. Sarah, the owner, wore her signature knitted shawl and smiled when she recognized me browsing the children's section. "Shopping for the grandchildren again, Mrs. Richardson?" she asked warmly. I paused, then surprised myself by shaking my head. "Not today, I am just looking." I hadn't made that decision consciously, but something inside me refused to continue the one-sided tradition of giving without acknowledgement. I wandered through the young adult section, running my fingers along book spines without really seeing the titles. Sarah appeared beside me carrying 2 steaming mugs. "We are looking for someone to read stories to children on Saturday mornings. The kids come in their pajamas and sit around our little fireplace. It is absolutely magical." I accepted the warm mug gratefully. "You think I could do something like that? You have the perfect voice for it," she said without hesitation, calm and gentle, the kind that makes people want to listen closely. I didn't respond immediately, just sipped the tea and considered her suggestion. Reading to children had been one of my greatest joys during Michael's childhood, but no one had ever invited me to share that skill beyond our family circle. I sat on the cushioned window seat, watching fresh snow begin to fall outside. The flakes drifted past the glass silently, covering the sidewalk in pristine white. Inside, the soft sounds of turning pages and Sarah's quiet movements created a sense of sanctuary I hadn't experienced in years. Gradually, I realized there existed a world where I didn't need to earn my place through gifts, silence, or sacrifice. I would simply never allowed myself to explore it. When I left Stone and Stories, I carried only Sarah's business card with the storytelling schedule printed in cheerful blue ink. I slipped it into my coat pocket without making any promises or commitments. The wind had grown sharper during my visit, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. My apartment felt especially quiet when I returned, with no one waiting and no messages on my answering machine. Last year's unopened gift box still sat on my dining table, like a monument to misplaced hope. I opened my daily planner to a blank page. No appointments scheduled. No shopping lists prepared. Like in previous years, I picked up my pen and wrote one sentence in careful handwriting. This year, I will bring nothing and see who still wants me there. I sat at that table for a long time afterward, staring at those words. Perhaps it was finally time to calculate everything I would given and determine what remained for myself. My background in accounting had taught me to track every dollar meticulously, but I would never applied that skill to measure what I would contributed to my family financially. Until this week, I would never needed to know the total cost of my generosity. I printed my bank statements and spread them across the dining table, which doubled as my desk in this small apartment. The oak surface bore scars from daily use, a water ring from a coffee mug, scratches from countless projects over the years. A red pen sat beside my calculator and a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. This exercise wasn't about assigning blame or keeping score. I simply needed to understand how much of my life I would invested in others without ever being valued in return. First entry: $250 monthly for internet service for 5 years straight. Keep the account in your name, Mom, so we will not lose service if we forget to pay, Nicole had requested. I would nodded and agreed without calculating the long-term cost. Total: $15,000. Next item: emergency home repairs. When Michael's basement flooded 2 winters ago, I would cover the insurance deductible and additional costs immediately. $13,800. Car loan down payment. When Nicole's old vehicle died unexpectedly, $8,500. Summer camp for Emma, $2,400. Hospital bills when Lucas broke his arm, $4,100. Groceries, utilities, school supplies, medical costs I would quietly absorbed over the years. I entered each amount into a simple spreadsheet, creating neat columns for dates, descriptions, and totals. The final number stopped me completely: $293,600. I stared at that figure for nearly an hour, not because the amount shocked me, but because I would never realized how much I could give away and still survive financially. Not comfortably, but survive nonetheless, while feeling completely empty inside. My phone sat silent on the table. I picked it up and dialed the law office I would use for estate planning. I need to cancel all automatic transfers immediately, and I would like to schedule a review of my financial authorizations. I told the receptionist calmly. My hand remained steady as I spoke. This wasn't an emotional decision. It was purely practical. That afternoon, I drove to Maple Grove Cafe, a small restaurant that still made real mashed potatoes and served coffee in actual ceramic mugs. Frank, a fellow retiree I would worked with on several community fundraisers, was already waiting in our usual booth near the kitchen. "Heard you are reconsidering your estate planning," he said as I sat down. Frank had always been direct in a way I appreciated. No small talk or dancing around difficult subjects. I nodded. "I think it is time to redefine what family legacy actually means." Frank didn't pry for details. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote something on a fresh page. "I usually give this advice to other retirees, but it applies perfectly to your situation." He slid the paper across the table. I read his words silently. "They didn't exclude you because you weren't worthy. They excluded you because they assumed you would always be available anyway." I laughed quietly, not from amusement, but from recognition. Maybe I was too available for too long. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Sometimes people who have lived long enough understand how to offer support without intrusion. Frank ordered another coffee while I declined. Anything additional? For years, I believed that if I didn't help them, they would struggle financially. I said as the afternoon light began to fade through the cafe windows. Frank didn't offer advice or judgment, he simply nodded with understanding. I left before dark, walking the short distance down Main Street where Christmas lights had been strung between lampposts, casting pools of warm yellow light on the snowy sidewalks. Outside First National Bank, an elderly woman sat at a small table, carefully counting coins from a worn fabric purse. Her winter gloves had holes at the fingertips, and the plastic cup beside her had a crack running down one side. She didn't look at passers-by, just focused intently on her task. I stopped and watched her for a moment, not from pity, but from recognition. Perhaps she, too, had once been the person who always prepared, always sacrificed, always said yes to others' needs. Then one day, nobody needed that anymore. No one had pushed her away dramatically. They would simply stop saving her a place at the table. Back home, I opened my file cabinet and created a new folder labeled Personal Fund. I transferred $12,000 into a separate savings account, money that would be mine alone, requiring no one's permission or approval. Night fell slowly over Millfield Springs. The wind whispered against my windows, but the lamp beside my chair created a circle of warmth and light. For the first time in years, I wrote my own name at the top of a financial document without any family member listed below it. I closed the folder and looked out at the frost-covered window. For the first time in years, I didn't want to remain in a place where people kept me around simply because I was familiar. I didn't leave a note explaining my absence, no dramatic farewells or lengthy explanations. I simply packed a bag, took the keys to the lake cottage that had belonged to my parents, and drove through the gathering snowfall toward a place where no one expected anything from me. The cottage sits beside Willow Pond Lake, surrounded by birch trees that turn silver in winter moonlight. The drive from town takes about 30 minutes, but I took my time, letting my car navigate the winding road at its own pace. When I turned the key in the cottage door, the scent of old wood and last winter's fireplace ashes greeted me like a gentle embrace. Nothing had been disturbed since my last visit the previous spring. No one else had keys, and no one else had reason to come here. I wondered briefly if Nicole remembered this cottage was where we would celebrated Emma's 4th birthday, back when she still called me Grandma Dot without being prompted. Probably not. She preferred houses with reliable internet and modern conveniences now. I lit the fireplace slowly, using newspaper and dry kindling from the wooden crate beside the hearth. The flames caught with a soft, crackling sound, like a sigh of contentment. The hardwood floors creaked familiarly under my feet, a welcoming sound I would missed. I unpacked my small suitcase and pulled back the bedroom curtains to let in the pale winter light. For the first time in months, I was somewhere by choice rather than obligation. Somewhere I didn't need to explain my presence or justify taking up space. That afternoon, I walked to the seasonal farmers market, where only a few vendors remained open despite the cold weather. Space heaters hummed quietly under the canvas tents. I bought a bag of late-season apples and paused at the baked goods stand. The woman next to me looked familiar. Ruth Morgan from my high school graduating class. We would exchanged Christmas cards sporadically over the years. I knew she would been living alone since her husband passed away, and I would heard through mutual friends that her daughter had tried to sell Ruth's house without consulting her. Ruth had taken her daughter to court and kept her property. She looked up and recognized me immediately. "Dorothy Richardson, what brings you out to the lake in December?" I smiled. "Just needed some quiet time." She held up a bag of apple turnovers. "These still taste exactly like my mother used to make. Sometimes the old recipes are the only things that don't need improvement." We purchased our items and walked back toward the cottage together. I made hot chocolate using my grandmother's recipe, real cocoa powder, a splash of vanilla, and a pinch of cinnamon. Ruth sat on the cottage's front steps, back against the wooden railing, looking out at the lake where a thin sheet of ice had begun to form near the shore. We drank our cocoa from mismatched ceramic mugs, watching the afternoon light slice across the frozen water in long orange streaks. No one mentioned absent children or unanswered phone calls. At our age, being here together was explanation enough. "I kept the cottage," Ruth said quietly. "But some days, the silence feels heavier than loneliness." She wasn't looking at me, just speaking to the wind. I understood completely. There are evenings when the heating system makes ordinary sounds, but they echo like whispers calling your name from an empty dream. Not because the house is cold, but because no familiar voices fill the rooms. We didn't speak for several minutes, just listened to the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the rustle of bare birch branches overhead. I told Ruth about the cottage's history, how my father had built it himself, choosing every stone for the foundation. Michael had learned to swim in this lake during the summer. He turned 7. Children never treasure the places they didn't pay for. Ruth observed with a knowing smile. "Then we keep them," I replied. "Not to prove a point, but to preserve what is left of ourselves." I wasn't certain Ruth fully understood my meaning, but I didn't need her to. That statement was meant for me, a quiet promise from someone who had nearly forgotten her own value. The sun dropped lower toward the horizon. Ruth stood to leave, waving without making promises about future visits. People who have survived to our age understand how to reconnect when it truly matters. I gathered our empty mugs and folded the small blanket I would brought outside. The fire inside still glowed warmly, and the cottage felt more like home than my apartment in town had in months. As I hung my coat on the wooden peg beside the door, I heard a gentle knock. I opened it to find Tom Peterson, my neighbor from across the lake. He held a tin wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen twine. "Oatmeal cookies," he said simply. "Made too many." I accepted the tin gratefully. He nodded once and turned to leave. "Welcome back to the quiet season," he called over his shoulder. I didn't call him back to chat, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like my heart was freezing. Along with the winter air, I closed the cottage door and settled beside the fireplace. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the telephone to ring. I never told anyone the cottage's location, but 3 days later, I spotted a familiar dark blue minivan parked beside the mailbox at the end of my gravel driveway. It was the same vehicle Nicole had insisted they needed for family safety. The one with heated seats and a backup camera that Michael still couldn't operate properly. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warm in my hands, and didn't move closer to see who had come. I didn't step back either. I simply waited. They emerged after several minutes of what I imagined was discussion about whether to approach the cottage. Nicole stepped out first, wearing her cream-colored wool coat, and carrying a rectangular package wrapped in gold paper. Michael followed, his expression unreadable beneath his navy knit cap. Emma appeared last, wearing a red winter jacket and holding something round made from evergreen branches and silver ribbon. I opened the door wide enough to welcome them inside, but I didn't step outside to greet them. I spoke one simple sentence. "There is fresh coffee if you would like some." No enthusiastic hugs, no questions about why I would left town or expressions of worry about my well-being. I wasn't waiting for those gestures, and they didn't pretend to offer them. Nicole placed her wrapped package on the cottage's central table, homemade cookies, judging by the size and weight. Michael looked around the room as though seeing it for the first time. Though he would spend countless childhood summers here, Emma stood quietly near the small Christmas tree I would assembled from pine branches I would gathered outside. No electric lights, just a few paper angels and pine cones tied with red ribbon. I poured coffee into ceramic mugs, not asking what anyone wanted to drink. Nicole spoke first. "Mom Richardson, I realize our conversation on Sunday was abrupt. You leaving town made us think we should talk." I didn't respond immediately, just set a steaming mug in front of her. Emma placed her handmade wreath on the table, twisted wire, fabric scraps, and 2 slightly crooked paper snowflakes that looked like they would been cut by hand. I picked up the wreath carefully, examining her work with genuine interest, then nodded appreciatively. Michael sat in the wooden chair near the fireplace, lower than where I stood. I hadn't seen him look up at me from that angle in years. After a long pause, he said softly, "Your leaving made me realize how much we have taken you for granted." I sat across from him, hands wrapped around my warm mug. The only sounds were the gentle popping of burning logs and the wind moving through the birch trees outside. When I was present, no one noticed, I said calmly. Now that I am absent, that is the problem. No one argued or tried to defend their previous behavior. Nicole shifted forward slightly. I brought gingerbread, the kind with molasses that you have always liked. I nodded, but didn't open the package or offer thanks. I would lived long enough to recognize that not everything brought to your doorstep represents genuine affection. The warm light from the table lamp made the cottage feel cozy, but nothing could warm the emotional distance between us. I picked up Emma's wreath and hung it on a nail beside the bedroom door, the same nail where I would hung holiday decorations for years. Emma watched me carefully, pressing her lips together the way her mother does when trying not to cry. I returned to my seat without commenting. Michael glanced toward the frost-covered window. "Are you planning to come back to town, Mom?" I shook my head slowly. "I understand," he whispered. "Everything feels empty without you there." I looked at this man who had once been afraid of thunderstorms, who used to crawl into my bed during winter nights when ice shifted on the roof and made sharp cracking sounds. Now he owned a house, supported a family, and still didn't understand how much space a mother actually needs. I didn't blame him for his confusion. I didn't forgive him either. I simply said, as gently as wind through pine branches, "I am not angry with any of you. I just don't live according to other people's schedules anymore." Nicole paused as though something had caught in her throat, but couldn't find words to express it. Emma sat motionless, hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence on this cold winter afternoon felt like a complete conversation in itself. When they prepared to leave, I didn't walk them to their car. I remained in my chair, hand resting on the smooth table surface. I heard their footsteps crunching through the snow, car doors opening and closing with muffled thuds. But before the minivan pulled away, I looked through the window and saw Emma turn her head toward the cottage. She smiled, a shy expression that reminded me of my own face in childhood photographs. I couldn't tell if that smile was meant for me. But either way, their visit had closed one chapter and opened a path I would chosen for myself. I used to answer to mom, wife, grandmother, the reliable woman who never forgot important dates or failed to appear when needed. But that morning, as I walked across the frost-covered path carrying a basket of homemade muffins and a well-worn book of children's stories, no one had asked me what I wanted to be called. Snow fell gently, tiny flakes collecting on my dark coat sleeves and the tops of my winter boots. The scarf around my neck, hand-knitted in soft blue wool, was a gift Emma had given me 3 years ago, back when she still made crafts specifically for me. Stone and Stories occupied the corner building, where Main Street met Elm, in the section of downtown where everything moved at a more thoughtful pace. The door opened with a cheerful bell sound, and Sarah looked up from arranging a display of local authors. "Dorothy," she called warmly, as though I were someone she would been hoping to see. No one here knew about the silent dinners I would endured, or the family meetings where my presence had become unwelcome. Here, I was simply the woman who brought treats and stories to share. The reading corner was positioned near the large front window, where natural light streamed through, even on cloudy days. Children sat cross-legged on the circular rug, wearing funny winter hats and mittens, small hands wrapped around cups of warm apple cider. I sat carefully in the cushioned chair, placed my muffin basket on the nearby wooden table, and opened the storybook. The tale I chose that morning featured no princesses or dragons, just an elderly woman living peacefully in a forest cabin. She had once belonged to a large, busy family, but gradually, one by one, they had forgotten how to visit. The children listened with bright, attentive eyes. They didn't interrupt with questions or fidget impatiently. They didn't need to know the woman's history or real name. They simply needed to know. She continued lighting her fireplace each evening. sharing stories with the rabbits and chickens, and finding contentment in her chosen solitude. I spoke in my natural voice. No theatrical gestures or exaggerated expressions, just as though I were reading to myself. When the story concluded, I passed around the muffins I would baked that morning. Blueberry with a touch of lemon zest. The children didn't ask personal questions about my family or living situation. They simply asked, "Will you tell us another story next week?" I nodded, feeling like I still had something valuable to offer the world. After the children left with their parents, I stayed to help Sarah straighten the reading area. She approached me with a small business card printed on cream, colored paper. "We would love to have you read stories regularly," she said. "If you are interested, I could make a small sign, Saturday Story Time with Dorothy Richardson." I smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks, not because of the title, but because I saw my name written without any family roles attached to it. That afternoon, I wandered through downtown Millfield Springs without any particular destination. The December air was cold enough to remind me that winter doesn't offer false comfort, but gentle enough that I didn't feel pressured to hurry indoors. I paused outside Miller's flower shop, not to make a purchase, but to breathe in the mingled scents drifting through the doorway. During my married years, I would been too busy managing everyone else's needs to notice the difference between the fragrance of roses and carnations. Now I had time to distinguish between them. The same way I was learning to recognize the difference between being genuinely loved and simply being useful. When I returned to the cottage that evening, I hung my coat on the wooden peg and rekindled the fire. Emma's wreath still hung beside the bedroom door, dried now but not broken. I moved it to the front window where I could see it daily, not for anyone else's benefit, but as a reminder that I was still capable of holding on to beautiful things. That night, I opened my leather-bound journal, the same one I would kept since moving to the cottage. Instead of expense lists or family obligations, I wrote one simple sentence. "Today, a little girl said, 'I tell stories like magic.'" I paused after writing those words, not because they were particularly poetic, but because I had once believed I possessed nothing that could be called magical. Now I understood that some magic doesn't require grand gestures or special training. It appears the moment you stop trying to be someone else. The next morning, I returned to stone and stories, not because anyone had asked me to, but because I enjoyed the scent of books and the way people greeted each other with genuine attention. I signed the community calendar Sarah kept by the cash register, writing simply Dorothy beside Saturday's story time. No Mrs. or grandmother or other titles that defined me through relationships with other people. Just my name, nothing more. I used to be called many things. Wife, mother, grandmother, babysitter, the one who cooked holiday dinners, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, even when they forgot mine. I never complained about these roles. I simply believed I was meant to tend the fire that kept everyone else warm during difficult seasons. I used to think love meant preparing everything quietly, without being asked, like the Christmas tree that appeared fully decorated before the children woke up, or the Thanksgiving turkey that emerged from the oven perfectly timed, or the money I withdrew from my retirement account when Michael lost his job. No receipts, no reminders. Just a mother doing what mothers do. I grew accustomed to not receiving formal invitations, but always appearing anyway, bringing food, gifts, and my steady presence. I thought this was normal, as if my worth could be measured by what I contributed rather than whether anyone actually wanted me there. Then one day, I stopped being called. Not because I died, but because I was no longer useful in the way they had come to expect. I remember that final breakfast meeting where I nodded calmly, as though someone had untied the rope that connected me to the word family, and I simply sat there, accepting my dismissal. That morning, I realized some losses happen without dramatic scenes, like when you leave a restaurant, and no one watches you walk away. As someone trained in accounting, I had always been skilled with numbers, but I had never calculated what I would given to my family over the years. $3,600 without a single acknowledgement. I am not sharing this figure out of bitterness, just stating the quiet truth I needed to face. Someone once told me that kindness might not always be appreciated, but dignity should never be abandoned. I moved to the cottage not from anger, but to begin again. I swept the front porch, stacked firewood beside the door, and hung fresh curtains in the windows. I sat with Ruth, a woman whose own children had betrayed her trust, and together we discovered this simple truth. We didn't need to wait for someone else to light the fire for us anymore. When Michael and Nicole appeared at my door, I wasn't angry. I simply wasn't afraid of being misunderstood any longer. I didn't offer explanations or ask for forgiveness. I poured coffee and listened. When Emma presented me with her handmade wreath, I accepted it gracefully. Not because she was my granddaughter, but because I recognized in her eyes the child I once was, waiting for someone to touch her shoulder and say, "You are enough. You have always been enough." I read stories to children at Stone. And stories now, not because I need recognition, but because I still have something to give, this time by choice rather than obligation. I tell those stories under my own name, without titles or family roles attached. If you are hearing this story from your own quiet living room or during a solitary drive home, I want to ask you something important. When was the last time you did something purely for yourself? Perhaps you were once like a beloved quilt that kept an entire household warm through many winters, until one season when nobody felt cold anymore. They folded you up and stored you away, forgetting how much they had once depended on your warmth. But what if that quilt learned to shake itself clean, to absorb sunshine, and to wrap itself around its own shoulders? Perhaps then it would feel warmer than anyone had ever imagined possible. Maybe you were once that quilt too. If this story resonates with your heart, think of someone who loved you quietly and without conditions. Perhaps your grandmother, your mother, or the neighbor who brought you cookies during your first winter in a new town. Don't wait for another season to pass before you remember this. Some hearts only remain open when you remember to treasure them while they are still beating. Thank you for walking through Dorothy's journey with me today. Her story reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim our worth and choose ourselves. If you have experienced something similar, please share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Don't forget to subscribe to Her Light for more stories about women who found their strength after loss, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Remember, beautiful souls, you were never meant to live in the shadows of your own life. Until next time, keep shining your light.